You're listening to TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour, with your host, the Director of Dixie Heritage, Dr. Ed DeVries.
If you're one of our regular listeners, then you were tuned in a couple of weeks ago when our guest was investigative journalist Pat Shannan. Of course, you probably remember from that interview that Pat had a journalism career that spanned over 4 decades. And it's really hard to cram 4 decades of reporting into an hour radio broadcast. And so we just scratched the surface on some of the big stories that Pat Shannan had covered over the years. But we said we'd have him back, and we're doing that today. Pat, once again, will be our guest, and we're going to talk about John Wilkes Booth. We're going to talk about Sirhan. We're going to talk about the Kennedy assassination. Did you realize that both Presidents Nixon and Bush were in Dallas at the time of the Kennedy assassination, and afterwards neither one of them could recall having been there? Of course, there's been a lot of cloud of controversy surrounding the Kennedy assassination for a number of years. Pat's going to try to pull the cloud back for us just a little bit. Also, talk about how Sirhan, it was later determined, was actually under hypnosis when he shot Bobby Kennedy. Just some interesting things that we're going to discuss. We're going to discuss some other major news events that have taken place over the last 30 years as well, and some of the aspects of those stories that did not get reported by the mainstream media. And so I think you're really going to enjoy today's program. And so what I'm going to do now is, without need of any further introduction, I'm just going to take us straight into our interview with investigative journalist Pat Shannan. You had mentioned that LBJ had made a shocking admission of assassination involvement to his mistress.
Johnson knew too much, and we don't even have to take the words of Lyndon to see the role that he played. And I don't think he had any of the planning, as the CIA was tending to that. And I don't think Johnson was smart enough to do that anyway. But he certainly was instrumental and a great necessity in the cover-up by his being president. And, of course, he handpicks the Warren Commission, and a couple of them who weren't too excited about going on, he actually grabbed a couple of them by the collar, one of them being, I think, Richard Russell, senator from Georgia. Actually, yelled at him and manhandled him. But anyway, of all people, he picks Allen Dulles. Well, Allen Dulles was the head of the CIA that probably was the brains of the Kennedy assassination, because JFK had fired him. And he had all the motive to want to get rid of the president, and certainly when it became a big enough deal for the whole CIA to be in on it, he was a natural choice. He was the brains of the operation, and here Lyndon Johnson appoints him on the Warren Commission to be sure the cover-up maintains.
Well, I've wondered if the Kennedy assassination wasn't some kind of an induction to some
Well, as one astute writer said, it was the day that America lost her innocence, November 22nd, 1963. And, of course, you not being around then, you couldn't see the change, but I saw it. I was 23 at the time, so old enough to see what's going on, but just not old enough to know better yet.
And
I think you got to be about it. I was in my 40s before Tupper Saucy came along with the Miracle on Main Street, and began to educate me on the money issue. It seems like we have to get to be about 40 or so in this world and today to start putting things together.
And the source for this is, I'm going to polarize my audience when I say the source is questionable. But Alex Jones is the source of this.
Okay.
The older I get, the more I begin to question Alex Jones, but that's another conversation for another day.
Many do. I understand.
But if Alex Jones is correct, both Richard Nixon and George H.W. Bush were on the grassy knoll on the day of the Kennedy assassination.
Oh, yeah. Well, now he's mistaken. Nixon had already flown back to New York. But, yeah, we got pictures of George there standing on the street. In fact, it's in my two Oswald's book, Harvey and Lee. But by the way, John Armstrong did all that great research on Harvey Lee. I give him credit. I have the Reader's Digest version of his 1,000-page epic classic of Harvey and Lee, but mine's like maybe 150 pages or so discernible. But Armstrong did a remarkable job on what so many of us suspected already, that there was a Harvey and there was a Lee, but it was up until the 90s when Bob Groden had written a little bit about it. Jim Mars and we just had touched on it, but none of us had really done the research that John Armstrong did. And when he did, I was just flabbergasted with Harvey and Lee. And he put that book out about 2000. By 2013, I was sharing a table with Jim Mars in Dallas at the 50th anniversary of the Kennedy deal at one of those big expos. Somebody asked me, about that, and I said, well, you can get John Armstrong's Harvey and Lee, the 1,000-pager, for about $400, or you can pay $20 and get the Reader's Digest version here. But I told people, and I've said it on the air before, that my book was not inspired. My book was provoked. I was angry by 2013 that people are supposed to be on our side, and I'm talking about Jesse Ventura and Jerry Corsi and some people that are, allegedly writing these great exposés of the behind the scenes of the Kennedy assassination, and they still talk about a singular Oswald. Well, it's so obvious to anybody that does a little bit of reading on the subject. Even my Reader's Digest version is sufficient to see that indeed there was a Lee Harvey Oswald born on October the 18th, 1939 in New Orleans of all places, one of the most distinguishable American accents anywhere, the Cajun. And at age 17, Lee Harvey Oswald, in 1956, drops out of high school, joins the Marines, goes to Japan, allegedly spent 6 weeks in language school, and came out speaking Russian so fluently that by the time he went to Russia and met Marina in 1959, I think he met her in 60, he was speaking the language so fluently that she thought he was a native. Now, that's what got my attention way back in about 66 when I learned that. It's ridiculous. When you see, we even got pictures of the two mothers. Lee's mother, who was far more attractive than the Marguerite that the world learned to know after Harvey was killed. But Harvey's mother was the only one that we ever knew from the news. But we gave me out pictures. And by the way, Harvey's mother was a good, I think, 15 years older than Lee's mother. And it's obvious in the pictures. The discrepancies go on and on and on. And we even got to have a witness who just died a couple of years ago. But he and Harvey were in high school together in 57. October the 4th, I believe it was the day the Russians launched Sputnik. And that was a big deal then in the news because, holy smokes, the Russians are getting ahead of us. They're going to go to the moon. And more fear-mongering put out by the media during the Cold War. On that day, McBride was this man's name. He's in my book. I forget his first name. But Mr. McBride and Harvey Oswald were discussing the fact that the Russians had launched the Sputnik, and they spent a great time. Harvey was quite an intellectual. Lee was bigger and stronger and actually a street fighter. Harvey was not. Harvey was kind of a wuss. But nevertheless, very intellectual, very well read. And of course, he spoke fluent Russian because he's the one who went to Russia. And McBride were there together, and that was the focus of his memory. He knew that he was with Harvey Oswald in October of 57, but Lee had gone to Japan in the Marines the previous year in 56. So the evidence just becomes over and over, jumping out various different ways.
So how was Lee Harvey Oswald actually framed for the Kennedy assassination? I mean, I know you've kind of talked about how there were two different Oswalds. I mean, it's obvious that things didn't happen the way the Warren Commission would have us to believe that it happened, unless you believe magic bullets and so forth. But how exactly did they frame everything onto Oswald?
Well, Lee, of course, was CIA, FBI payroll, this sort of thing. He was controlled. I think Lee was more CIA, and Harvey was FBI, drawing the FBI check, and they got him the job, of course, at the school book depository. But they looked so much alike that they were brought together in the 50s as kids. They weren't brought together to kill Kennedy. They were brought together for something. Because after World War II, and here's this kid who speaks fluent Russian in the 50s, they said, wow, we can use him somewhere. Jim Mars put out a little scenario that made a lot of sense. because at that time, Robert Oswald, Lee's older brother, not Harvey's, Lee's older brother, Robert, was already in military intelligence and a young soldier in 53, and somehow the supposition would have been that the FBI put out this picture and said, who do we know that looks like this? And he somehow got to Robert Oswald, and he said, you know what, yeah, he does look a lot like me, but I tell you what, he looks a whole lot more like my little brother. And that very well could have been the scenario that brought the two together. We don't know. We do know that they were brought together in mid-50s, like 53, when he actually were both in junior high school, and that's when this guy, McBride, knew Harvey, and so many others knew Lee, and when they were shown pictures of Harvey's mother, those who knew Lee said, no, that's not Mrs. Oswald. This over and over and over. So Lee, probably about the time he went into the Marines, and Harvey later followed, a year later, after 57, but it was probably around this time that they were deciding to use them for something. I don't believe, from what my research has produced, until April of 63, 7 months prior to the assassination, I don't believe that they had put the plan in action yet. That's probably when Harvey went to New Orleans. He was back from Russia. He came back in 62. By the way, Thanksgiving of 62, I digress again, but in Thanksgiving of 62, they had a big family gathering, Fort Worth, and John Pick, who was Lee's half-brother, the firstborn of Robert and Lee's mother. John Pick, born in 33, I think, and Robert in 34 or 5, and Lee, of course, in 39. But John Pick was at the family gathering, and he told the Warren Commission this later, that when he saw who he was told was his brother, saw Lee and shook his hand, he didn't recognize him, the same person. And John Pick even told the Warren Commission that, but Allen Dulles quickly sidestepped it and got it ditched.
So then they actually switched Oswald's within their family then?
Well, that's what I was getting at, because you see, this whole thing could be solved in a minute by getting Robert Oswald's DNA. Of course, he would not cooperate with that, but there are many ways to get it anyhow, out of garbage and stuff. But once we had Robert Oswald's DNA, it would only be a matter of going to Harvey's two girls. June is one. In fact, she's been outspoken on the internet, YouTubes and stuff. She's very much interested in her father's case, and certainly doesn't buy the story. So she would be cooperative. She would be delighted, I'm sure, to share her DNA to prove that indeed Harvey was her brother and Robert was not her uncle. And after the murder and after Oswald's murder and the whole bit, Kennedy, of course, was shot on Friday. Oswald was killed on Sunday in the jailhouse, and they both were buried on Monday. Robert Oswald never visited his alleged nieces, ever, because they weren't his nieces.
Right. You had mentioned in your book that Jack Ruby wasn't really the one who killed Lee Harvey Oswald.
Ralph Sinque down in Houston, who put together the Oswald Innocence Project, and he had some interesting pictures. Jim Mars never believed it. I was still on the fence, but he had some very interesting pictures of the alleged Ruby shooting Oswald that you've all seen 1,000 times. The haircut in back was not Ruby's haircut, but he did compare it to some pictures he found of an FBI agent who was actually shorter than Ruby. He was only like 5'6" or something. And it made for a very interesting read, but I neither accept it nor deny it. I just don't know. Jim Mars said, no way. He didn't buy it at all. It would help explain a little bit why Ruby, if he did that, I mean, if he didn't shoot him, but he would play the game, was because of, once again, they had too much on him with the mob and everything. And of course, the mob always promises to get their people out of trouble. And they may have gotten Ruby out of trouble. Let's remember that in January of 67, as I remember, Ruby had gotten a new trial granted because of, I don't know, some technicality. Suddenly, he ends up with cancer, and he's dead before they can have another trial. So maybe, indeed, the mob did get in there and help him by getting a new trial and stuff. but they had no control of the CIA. They had to, they could not stop Ruby from getting murdered, if indeed they did inject him. Don't know. Speculation.
So how was James Earl Ray basically framed for the assassination of Martin Luther King?
Oh, much the same as Oswald and others. Ray was a petty thief, and he had never done harm to anybody. There was no record at all of him anywhere of being any kind of hater of the black race, even though that was painted later by the media. He was in the Missouri State Penitentiary. I think it was armed robbery or something. Not. It was a felony, but I don't think it was anything any stronger than that. But in April of '67, he escapes from Missouri State Penitentiary in the back of a bread truck. And we find out many, many years later that the warden was paid off quite handsomely by the FBI to get Ray out. He obviously had the profile of one that they could use as a patsy. But anyway, he escapes in a bread truck, and his brother, John, who lived in East St. Louis, Illinois, across the river, of course, from Missouri, picked him up. Obviously, that had to have been set up also. How would John Ray have known to be there? And he took him to his house in East St. Louis, and James stayed there about a month before he went on to Chicago, and he bought him a old Chrysler, and I can't remember, the Chrysler was his first or second car, but one of them didn't work, and he got another one and was able to go on to Montreal, where he hooked up with an FBI agent by the name of Raoul. Raoul was all James ever knew him as. In the time in Chicago, and there was a researcher that I met about 15 years ago who had taken a great interest in the King and Ray case and the Ray frame. He's dropped out. I'm not going to mention his name because I think he might. All I know is he dropped out of the game a year or two after he and I were corresponding, and I think they got to him. I think they frightened him because he was uncovering too many things, and so I'd rather help him maintain his privacy. But he's from Minneapolis area. Found this 302, a 302 form you probably know, but your audience may not, is what FBI agents use for every incident, every confrontation, everything they did that day. It had anything to do with any sort of crime, they got to write up a report. It's called the 302. Well, my friend found Freedom of Information Acts, some of the FBI 302s, and here they had James Earl Ray tracking him in Chicago the month that he was in East St. Louis, and the next week or two or three he was in Chicago. Here are 302s where they're tracking him, and they also had gotten him some new ID with a driver's license that did not match anything that would have been Ray's, and also had the Missouri State Penitentiary change the escape report to not show him on the, they didn't have much of the computers in those days, but in NCIS, but whatever they had, any records would not show James Earl Ray as being an escaped prisoner. So you see, this was in April and May and June of '67, and King wasn't killed until April the 4th of '68. So obviously the FBI was behind this from the very beginning. They were setting him up as a patsy. So he gets to Montreal, and he meets Raoul, and Raoul befriends him, and first they want to do a test run because Raoul tells him they're going to be hauling some contraband, buys him a Mustang, and he drives to the border, and he does a little test run there and passes the test. He and Raoul go to New Orleans. James had a 504 area code, New Orleans area code phone number for Raoul up until the day that King was shot. Then the number was unplugged. Raoul sent him to Acapulco. He lay on the beach there for some time, and then he got into Los Angeles because they knew a plastic surgeon out there. James had pointed features, and they wanted to round off his nose a little bit and his chin and ears, I guess, to look more like some of the ID that he was going to be carrying from Canadian citizens. They go to end of March. They go to Birmingham, and Raoul from the motel room sends James over to buy a hunting rifle. Tell him it's for your brother-in-law. Well, he goes in to the gun store there. Aero Marine, I remember was the name of it. And he picks out a rifle and doesn't know much about them. The salesman recommends this Remington 270, and James says, okay, it's a good deer rifle, huh? Oh, yeah. So goes back to the motel room with it. Raoul says, no, that's not large enough bore. You got to take it back tomorrow. We need something bigger than that. James says, well, I don't know. Here's a catalog. Pick out what you want. I'll tell him. So he goes back in the next day and says he wants a larger bore, like a 30-06. And the salesman says, well, you tell your brother-in-law that 270 you bought yesterday, it'll bring down any deer in Alabama. That was the quote. And, of course, James picks up the 30-06 and pays the difference and goes back. Now, of course, the obvious reason for sending James back is to make doggone sure that gun salesman is going to remember one James Earl Ray. Right. And, of course, he did. He even remember telling him that about his brother-in-law and the deer. Now they went from, this is right at the end of March, and they go to Atlanta. Come to find out, it didn't make sense for a long time why they would have gone from Birmingham to Atlanta instead of Memphis. Come to find out, Martin Luther King was scheduled to go to Miami. He had a speech lined up in Florida that got canceled because of the garbage collector strike in Memphis. So he changed his plans and turned and went from Atlanta back to Memphis on the 2nd or 3rd of April. And, of course, it was Sunday night the 3rd, I guess, that he made his famous speech. And at that time, Ray and Raoul had turned around in Atlanta also and had driven to Memphis and put up in that flop house, which was across the street and up the hill from the Lorraine Motel. Hoover, at the time, J. Edgar Hoover, had actually manipulated the room that King was be renting at the Lorraine Motel because of the civil rights strife at the time. The all-white hotel that he had attempted to book into, I guess he might have even been there before, but they rejected him suddenly this time, and they had to go over to the Lorraine, which was right down the hill, 200 feet from the flop house. Now, Raoul and Ray are in the flop house on April the 4th, and all day long, Raoul tries to manipulate James to do this, that, and the other. And he finally, at 10 minutes to 6, was instructed to go downstairs to a place that's called Jim's Grill and stick up the grill and go down the street, down Main Street there, 2 blocks, 3 blocks to the Arcade restaurant. And he said, meet me there and we'll have some travel money. So James leaves his duffel bag and stuff up in the upstairs on the bed. He goes out and he doesn't go down to Jim's Grill and stick it up, but he gets in his white Mustang and calmly drives away. He goes down, as he said, to a tire dealer and to try to get the tires checked and rotated or whatever on his car, and the tire dealer said you have to come back in the morning. I'm too busy. We're getting ready to close at 6. King is shot at like 6:02 or 3, and what happens then is 2 guys, one, Raoul, the FBI agent, scoops up James's duffel bag and runs, first he was in the bathroom. He was in the bathroom with the 30-06. He never fired, just was there as a decoy. And as King is shot, he sees it, runs out of the bathroom. 2 people see him, Raoul, and neither could identify him as Ray. Both said it was not James Earl Ray. One of the women who said that went to the insane asylum for 10 years, very quietly. And, just a day or 2 later, they just captured her and kidnapped her right off the street. And Raoul packs up James's duffel bag, which contains a beer can with James's fingerprints, his clothes, book or 2, and the prison radio from the Missouri State Penitentiary with James Earl Ray's ID number engraved into the back. He runs down the stairs expecting to jump in the Mustang and take off. Raoul does. Right behind him is a man that we name in the book, and this is a story that very few people know, but the guy by the name of Butch Collier, who was a deputy sheriff in Caruthersville, Missouri, was traveling with my contact, James Green, and he was the one who actually killed King. And that detail is probably more than I want to try to get into today because nobody knows it. It's too intricate. Too many people have too many questions. But, of course, you can read about it in the current issue of the Barnes Review, all the details. But anyway, the 2 of them, the shooter, Collier, had run up the hill with his rifle and run up the stairs and going down the stairs right behind Raoul. The 2 of them run out on the street expecting to jump in James's Mustang, and instead it's gone. Well, they had actually had 3 white Mustangs. One was kind of a pale yellow. Collier had this one, and Raoul panics and throws that duffel bag in front of the business next door. It's an amusement gaming pinball machine type business. He throws the duffel bag with all that evidence in it in front of the doorway, and he and Collier jump in the other Mustang and spin the tires and take off. What the witnesses said was exactly true, that they saw 2 men come out of there, dump the duffel bag in front of their window, and jump in the Mustang and take off. They saw 2 people. That's because the patsy, had already quietly left and nobody saw him. And this is another piece that the FBI had to patch. Once again, that's in the details in the magazine article.
That magazine article that you've referred to twice in the last couple of minutes is, of course, the May-June 2018 issue of TBR Magazine, the Barnes Review magazine. That was a great issue. It also featured my article on secession and the law of God. I'd like to encourage all of our listeners, if you're not a subscriber to the Barnes Review already, to go to the Barnes Review's website and check out that last issue. And of course, the Barnes Review is our sponsor for TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. So we are going to pause here and have just a brief word from the Barnes Review. Then we'll be back with our guest, Pat Shannan. If you love listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, then I know that you'll love reading the Barnes Review. The Barnes Review is one of my favorite magazines. I began reading the Barnes Review long before they became a sponsor here on the program. In the Barnes Review, you will read vignettes of man, from the prehistoric to the very recent, from forgotten races and civilizations to first-person accounts of World War II and the late Cold War. There's just not a more interesting magazine published today, nor a more significant and important subject than real history. So if you'll visit www.barnesreview.org, that's www.barnesreview.org, you can find out how you too can become a subscriber to the Barnes Review. You can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review by mail, or you can subscribe to receive the Barnes Review electronically in PDF editions. Or you can subscribe to receive both. That's what I do. So visit www.barnesreview.org and subscribe to the Barnes Review. We're back with our guest, Pat Shannan. Pat, go ahead and pick up the story where you had to leave off right before our commercial.
That's how they set up James Earl Ray. He came back in his Mustang 5 or 10 minutes after 6, and there were cops all over the place. He's an escaped prisoner from Missouri, so he doesn't have any business hanging around there. Goes out of town and gets on Highway 78, I guess it was, towards Alabama, and he drives to Atlanta. And from Atlanta, he had some connections. Private plane apparently took him back to Canada out of Charlie Brown Airport there on the west side of Atlanta. And that's when he began to use the other ID. John Willard was one of the names, and he made his way to, of course, to Europe and Portugal. Somehow, some reason, was lured back into London is when they captured him in London Airport in June. They put him in jail in Shelby County there and literally tortured him. They played music. They left the lights on 24 hours a day. And this is June of 68, and they didn't try him until March. So those were his living conditions at the time. And he was later terrified. He had a criminal defense lawyer by the name of Percy Foreman. James called him Percy Four-Flusher. But Percy's the one who talked him in, and he apparently got $100,000 for talking Ray into pleading guilty, and without a trial. They couldn't afford to have a trial in this case. And James withdrew his guilty plea 3 days later, and there was a judge there in Memphis by the name of Battle. I want to say Preston Battle or Percy Battle. Last name was Battle. Judge Battle. What a name. And Judge Battle was considering Ray's papers when he was found dead at his desk, lying on top of James Earl Ray's plea to change motion to change his plea. That's where Battle died. Don't know why, don't know how, don't know if he got a needle or what, but he sure is dead. So there's the sordid details.
So you described these plans, whether it be with the King assassination or with the JFK assassination, and they're intricate, and these sources, these patsies, if you will, had been worked for a number of years. So do you think that it takes that many years to put everything in place? to commit the crime, or do you think that they're just grooming these people and then just plug them into whatever crime they want to commit when they...
Absolutely. That's exactly what they do. As I said earlier, they had certainly had no plans to kill President Kennedy in 1953 or 56 or 7, or even in 59 when Harvey went to Russia. Kennedy wasn't even president yet.
Right.
But they know they will use these guys for something. And Harvey, speaking fluent Russian as he did, they had him in the perfect place, especially when he hooks up and marries a Russian woman who actually had KGB connections through an uncle. So, yeah, so they're sitting on it, and they bring him home Thanksgiving time of 62. But as I said, I don't believe the mechanics were put into motion until April or May of 63. Harvey went to New Orleans, and Lee and Robert both were running loose in Dallas, and all kinds of plans were being made then.
Tell us briefly about Sirhan, and how they basically were able to pin the RFK assassination on the wrong man again.
I'm going to pull that chapter of a page out from my book because there's some important numbers in that on this question for you to understand. But Sirhan didn't know anything. He was under hypnosis. He was the classic Patsy. 10 o'clock that night, Kennedy wasn't shot until like 12:30, but it was June the 4th of 68. It was a Tuesday California primary, and Bobby Kennedy had been a latecomer to the race. Johnson dropped out in March, and I think that's when Bobby said, okay, make room for me. But he suddenly was the most popular. June the 4th, the Tuesday night primary, when they had been declared the winner, Kennedy stood in front of the microphone and thanked him and took his congratulations and said, now it's on to Chicago and let's win there. Chicago, of course, being the place for the Democratic Convention in July. Kennedy, he was assigned to check out credentials at the doorway of the Colonial Room, where the press conference was to be held. It was Kennedy's press secretary who actually turned him around and directed him to the kitchen toward where Sirhan was. Sirhan carried a Ivory Johnson 8-shot 22 revolver. I knew the gun well because I had one myself, exactly like it. It was a cheap close-range protection. I was a nightclub entertainer at that time. I had a folk singing trio and get paid off a lot of times in cash on Saturday night, and I just thought it was a good idea to travel with a weapon. So I owned the same gun. Now, I was in Australia. I was actually at the Sydney Morning Herald newspaper when the first teletype popped across in the press room there, and I tore it off and saved it. I still got it in my scrapbook. But shots rang out in the Ambassador Hotel ballroom tonight where Bobby Kennedy was speaking. That was it. I mean, that was about the most initial report that we could get. 8-shot revolver. Sirhan didn't empty it. He fired it 6 times. He was then overcome before he could empty the gun. He was firing wildly, and he never got closer than 3 or 4 feet, witnesses said, to Bobby Kennedy walking toward him. And two all-world athletes there, Rayford Johnson was decathlon champion in Rome in 60, and Roosevelt Greer was all-world Los Angeles Rams lineman. They were, of course, big Kennedy backers, and they subdued Sirhan. Either one of them could have done it with one hand, but both of them were on top of him. As I say, Sirhan fired 6 times and never remembered any of it. He wounded 5 people. Bobby Kennedy was shot in the back of the head behind the right ear twice. There were 4 shots that hit him, one through the tuft of his coat armpit sleeve and did not wound him, but went into the ceiling above, indicating that it was being fired from below. And another one went into Kennedy's back. And he died 25 hours later. He died on June the 6th. And it was actually, they say he was shot on the 5th, but it was, as I said, the night of the 4th, the Tuesday night primary, so that's the way I always remember it. Well, we get to trial. Sirhan tried to fire his attorney. He had a bogus attorney, and those details are in the magazine article again. But I won't try to explain here what was going on, except this one detail, and this is why I wanted to get the book. Because there was an investigative reporter back when we still had him by the name of Ted Chirac, who worked for a TV station in Los Angeles. He got some pretty good help. I still have his VHS video here. His astounding evidence showed with blow-ups of the microscopic ballistic printouts that the bullets removed from Kennedy's body were not fired from the same gun that wounded the other 5 victims. Now, this was not Chirac doing it, but an expert he had by the name of William Harper. Dropping down, here's the important part, Ed. Chirac also proves with an interview with the district attorney that a second .22 pistol was fired in the room that night, and that it was introduced into evidence at trial by the prosecution, no less. LAPD criminologist Dwayne Wolfer testified under oath that he had personally test-fired the weapon, an Iver Johnson .22 revolver with the serial number, get this, H18602, and had found it to be the weapon that had fired the bullets that had been removed from Kennedy's neck and several other victims. But now here comes the big however. However, the serial number on Sirhan's Iver Johnson weapon was not H18602, but H53725, and not one member of the defense team caught it. In a complaint to the Attorney General later, Wolfer was accused of suffering from a great inferiority complex for which he compensates by giving the police exactly what they need for conviction, blah, blah, blah. Well, they had just thrown egg all over everybody's face. But it goes to show, once again, how the defense for Sirhan was stacked against him, because even his defense attorney, doesn't catch something as obvious as that. In fact, I asked four other criminal defense attorneys over the period of time about this when I was writing this book. I said, is there any way that would have gotten past you? And they said, no way. As soon as they read out a serial number in the courtroom, we match it immediately. That's what we've got to do. And that was kind of standard operating procedure that I got from all the attorneys that I questioned about it. So more on the details in the Barnes Review article of what happened with Sirhan. But Sirhan, he himself believed he had done it. He didn't know why he had done it, but it was like 10 years into prison. He was like late 70s before he finally began to realize, and some other lawyers and people convinced him, investigators, that he had not done it, that he had not killed Kennedy. And but as I say, for a decade he believed he had. The evidence that they showed him, of course, proved it. But once again, that's the system framing a man for a murder of somebody that they needed to get rid of, because there was no doubt that Bobby Kennedy was going to be elected president. Hubert Humphrey was the second best Democrat who ended up getting the nomination, and he almost beat Nixon. So certainly Bobby Kennedy would have swamped Nixon.
So why do you think that it was so important to get Richard Nixon elected when he was the same person who, once he was in office, it became so important to get rid of him?
Well,
I mean, that would almost be like knocking off Hillary Clinton to make sure that Donald Trump became president.
You just reminded me of something else. Let me backtrack, and I'll be sure to come back to this. But you talked about both Nixon and George Bush being on the street with the Kennedy assassination.
Yes, sir.
No, Bush was. Nixon had already been was on a plane to New York, but they both had been there the night before at Clint Murchison's house. Do you know the Clint Murchison story?
No, sir.
Clint Murchison owned the Dallas Cowboys. He was an oil millionaire, and would be a billionaire today, in today's dollars, but also strong backer of Lyndon Johnson.
Can I ask you a crazy question? Did Larry Hagman play that guy in a movie?
If you're talking about that TV series of Dallas, no, that would not have been Murchison.
No, sir. There was a movie that was...
I don't know that then. You might be right.
There was a movie about the Kennedy assassination, and Larry Hagman played this millionaire who was basically orchestrating the assassination of the current president. And
well, that would be Murchison.
And then he was trying to get a young Republican to take his place.
Well, yeah, that would be Murchison. Now, there was a big meeting at Clint Murchison's house on Thursday night, the 21st, the night before the assassination. Johnson and Kennedy, of course, are in Fort Worth at a banquet. Madeline Duncan Brown, do you know that name?
It's not ringing a bell.
It's in my book on the two Oswalds. We even her picture. She and I became friends because we had met at an expo in '98 in Dallas, book expo, and she had her book there, and I introduced myself, and because we always trade books on Sunday afternoon before we leave, and she says, "Well, how do you do? I'm Madeline Duncan Brown. I said, Lyndon Johnson's girlfriend." She smiled. She had given birth to Lyndon's illegitimate son in 1950, and had remained his paramour, among others, of course, whenever Lyndon came back to Texas. But she got a call from Clint Murchison that there was going to be a big gathering at the house, and, would she like to stop by? She was kind of a party girl. She knew Jack Ruby. She used to hang out at the carousel. And she said she used to play checkers and cards with some of the carousel dancers at Ruby's nightclub and strippers. And I said, did you ever dance there? She's 75 years old now when I knew her. And I said, did you ever dance there? She said, no, but I always wanted to. But anyhow, she's at the party, and at about 10 o'clock, Lyndon Johnson comes in. And he has a drink, and he's angry. And they all of them go into the smoke-filled conference room, not Madeline. But Madeline said while she was in there, Jack Ruby stopped by. I said, Jack Ruby, hey, this is getting a little deep now. And she said, no, Jack, he didn't have anything to do with them except he was their pimp. And Ruby would supply the girls for the big wig politicians when they would come to town. So he came by and dropped off a couple of girls and said hello to Madeline and left. And when they broke up the meeting an hour or so later, they all came out, and she said Lyndon was steaming angry, and he came up to the bar where she was and said, after tomorrow, those blankety-blank Kennedys will never embarrass me again. He said, that's not a threat, that's a promise. And that's a quote she used verbatim for the rest of her life. She died in about 2002, I think, as I remember. Sure enough, when I got home, I had heard this story about Murchison from somebody else. In fact, it was CIA colonel who had actually flown what he called was the Crossfire assassination team into Dallas. And General Bowen, he became a general, he was a colonel when he was active, but Russell Bowen talked about that meeting, and he said, and this is down in Florida, a different time, I'm digressing here, but I had several great interviews with him, and he says, I get a big kick out of it when the only two guys in the world who can't remember where they were on the day Kennedy was killed were George Bush and Richard Nixon. And he says, I know where both the lying bastards were. They were with me at Clint Murchison's house. So, anyhow, that was the first indication I had of the big meeting. But now, that was in 94 or 5, and here in 98, I'm learning these things from Madeline, who was also there, and of course, the good book says, out of the mouths of two or more witnesses. Well, now I got my second witness, and I had never written a word about the Murchison thing until Madeline had confirmed it. And so they come out of the meeting and break up, and of course, everything else, as to say, is history the next day.
So did you ever confirm this story with Madeline after that? Did you and her ever discuss the subject again?
In just the early pages, she talked about the meeting, and I got her on the phone, and I was excited. I said, well, the Murchison party, were George Bush and Nixon there? Oh, he had said even Kissinger, Henry Kissinger was there, and she confirmed Nixon. But we got to remember, George Bush and Henry Kissinger, both of them in 1963, were pretty obscure characters. I mean, they were not publicly known or recognizable. So she could not confirm that. But yes, indeed, she confirmed Nixon, and too many other people, of course, have placed Bush in town. So he certainly would have been at that meeting at Murchison's house.
Okay, well, here's something, just because I've been looking it up, because I'm thinking, my memory has to be, you were talking and it was triggering something.
Okay.
Do you remember the movie Nixon? The one where, the movie where Anthony Hopkins played Richard Nixon?
Yeah, Hopkins, that's what I was trying to think of, yeah.
Hey, Larry Hagman played a character in that movie, and the name was Jack Jones.
Oh.
And here is the tag. Unlike some other characters in the film who represent actual people, Jack Jones, the billionaire investment banker and real estate tycoon, is a composite character and a reference to Nixon's meetings with Clint Murchison.
Ah. Okay, there you go.
So I knew when you were telling me that, it's like, I've seen that in a movie somewhere. So that's
the
where
party. Did they portray the party at Murchison's house in the movie?
They did, and I remember, I knew I had seen that in a movie somewhere, and apparently it was in the movie Nixon. So, it's amazing how sometimes, how do I say this? They hide the truth in plain sight.
Anyways, we need to pause here and have a brief word from another one of our sponsors. a publication that Pat Shannan many years ago was the editor-in-chief of the American Free Press.
If you're like me, and I'll bet you are because you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour, you like to be on the cutting edge of honest news and accurate information. You like to hear about the latest financial trends and to know what's happening around the world and right here in the United States, the things that can directly impact you, your life, and the life of your family. And if you're like me, you do not rely on the mainstream media to obtain this information because, frankly, you know that you just can't trust them. Fortunately, there is an alternative news outlet with a long-established track record for honesty and integrity, and that is the American Free Press. AFP is the preeminent alternative independent news source for honest, hard-working, truth-loving Americans. AFP is the antithesis of the controlled, lamestream media. AFP is employee-owned and has been so since its founding. Because of that, AFP never has and never will allow advertisers or special interests or big money to dictate what appears in the pages of the American Free Press newspaper. 26 times a year, the American Free Press newspaper can be delivered to your door, packed with the kind of uncensored news that I know you're going to appreciate. AFP covers the stories and tells the truth that the lamestream media is frankly scared to touch. And AFP offers real, on-the-scene reporting and commentary, the likes of which you will never see in the Washington Post, the New York Times, ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, or just about any other lamestream news source that you can think of. That's right, there's only one national populist news weekly staffed by an unsurpassed team of veteran investigative journalists who will dare to rip the veil off of many of the major news stories, and that's the American Free Press. AFP publishes exciting, in-depth, uncensored news and information that's grassroots and patriotic, information that Americans need to know in order to combat the growing police state. AFP stands firmly against the New World Order and against those who are working to establish a global plantation under the rule of a powerful few. In short, AFP is your voice. If you have any doubt why they want to silence AFP, you must be relying on the lamestream media for your news, and folks, that's a big mistake. If you're ever dissatisfied with your subscription to the American Free Press, their guarantee is that you just drop them an email and they will gladly refund the unused portion of your subscription. So what are you waiting for? Visit www.americanfreepress.net. Once again, www.americanfreepress.net. And find out about the American Free Press. Do it today.
To kind of turn the conversation a little bit, you had also written about the Lincoln assassination in your book.
Well, I have a separate book called The Great Escape of John Wilkes Booth. It's it can be have your audience look at iniworldreport.com in the book section there. We've got a $99 special. It includes the Oklahoma City bombing video. It includes 7 other books, and this is one of them. It amounts to something like less than half price when they buy the special. But the Lincoln assassination book is more written about Booth than it is Lincoln, because everybody knows what happened at Ford's Theater. But the Great Escape is something just about impossible to explain on the radio, of how Booth escaped, of course, that night and through the woods, and he got away to California. And a lot of people, students of history at least, know that he ended up overseas. The details they don't know is I came across a book written in 1937 by John Wilkes Booth's granddaughter. She was Izola Forrester, and the title is called This One Mad Act, and it's all about her grandfather, John Wilkes Booth. Well, we got Booth, of course, was allegedly killed in '65 in the barn at Garrett's farm, and but instead he lived. He got to California, and his wife, he had a daughter who was 5 years old. She was born in '60, and the wife, of course, and the 5-year-old daughter, and who was the mother of the author of the book, the granddaughter, remembered that when she was 5, the last time she saw her daddy was when he came by the house, and he was on horseback, and he had one of the slaves with him, was his guide, her mother handed her to Daddy Booth, and he hugged her and kissed her goodbye and left. Well, 2 years later, in '67, and this is a difficult part to explain, I'm not going to try to get into details except to tell you that Booth's wife went to California with someone else and hooked up with Booth, and when she returned 2 years later, I want to say January of '70, when she came back, she had a son with her, a baby. We printed his picture in the Booth book, and it's uncanny how much he looks like his daddy, John Wilkes Sr. This boy had to go by the name of Stevenson. He had a bogus name, of course, but I don't think there's anybody could doubt, looking at these two pictures, who the real father was, proving, of course, that John Wilkes Booth was still alive.
The last thing really would be the murder of NFL football star Pat Tillman.
Pat Tillman learned too much. Once again, he was very naive, and he had what we call the red, white, and blue fever, and really, I remember at the time how foolish I thought it was, and throughout 2002, he quits a very lucrative NFL contract, decides to join the Army and hook up with his brother and go to Afghanistan. Well, he didn't know that the real reason we were in Afghanistan was to protect the poppy seeds for the Bush family, and the same reason we were in Iraq, to guard the oil and steal it. I tell you, Pat Tillman was no dummy. Unfortunately, I found out he was an atheist, which I say too bad, because he was one of those guys that I've known 2 or 3 in my life that and I'm sure you've known them too, that they were too smart for their own good. And, you know, these liberals that reject God out of hand, I just say they're too smart for their own good. But anyway, that was Tillman's problem. But nevertheless, he was one smart dude. He was very well read, and he paid attention to a lot of the stuff going on. His mistake was that he was in touch back in the States with what's that leftist name? I'll think of it in a second. And he was corresponding and was planning to blow the whistle on the Bush family and the Afghanistan ploy. Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky? Recognize that name? He's a big leftist up there in Harvard and around. He and Pat Tillman had been corresponding by mail, and Tillman had told him a lot of the stuff that he had learned about the drug running, and Tillman had told Chomsky that he realized too late that he had been sent to Afghanistan to, quote, guard the poppy fields and protect American CIA drug investments for the U.S. banksters, not American freedoms. His mistake, though, Ed, was telling Chomsky that he was going to blow the whistle when he got home. And instead, he got murdered. Obviously, another CIA hit. First, they called him a hero, and it's pretty disgusting stuff to read. General Wesley Clark finally told the truth to the family. But at first they said, he was a hero, and they gave him the parents a Silver Star posthumously, and then they said, no, it was friendly fire, accidentally, and then they finally admitted a month or 2 or 3 later that he had been shot point blank in the range, probably from 10 feet away, shot right in the face. Oh, it was another rub out, and because once again he knew too much, they could not. Well, let's remember, he was George Bush's poster boy for the war.
Right.
Afghanistan in no way was ever accused about being involved in 9/11, and yet that's the first place we sent troops as an excuse to go into Iraq later. And it was the Saudis, the only ones that were ever blamed, and we never went into Saudi Arabia, you just went into Iraq and Afghanistan. The whole thing's a joke when you look at the details. Tillman, of course, discovered all this, and he no longer was going to be the poster boy for Georgia's war. And in fact, he was about to become a strong adversary, and that's why he had to be taken out.
So tell us, basically, how do we find you on the internet? How do we find your blogs and your articles, and also how do we find your books?
Best place to go for most all of that is INI, which is Independent News International, but INIWorldReport.com. And that will take you to the recent articles. It'll take you to the mainstream news cover-ups that we try to publish almost every day and do. Then on my book list and the book special there. But even if you don't want the $99 special, each of the things we've been talking about today are detailed in there, so you can bring them up separately. But that's kind of my forte. I'm a truth teller. I like to investigate and report the stuff that nobody else is reporting anymore. But it's INIWorldReport.com.
Okay, very good. And I appreciate you taking the time to spell all this stuff out for us today.
I don't get to talk this long and this much about all of them. As one guy told me, I guess it was a pretty nice compliment for somebody such as I, as an investigative reporter, trying to still be one. But he said, so-and-so knows all about this case, and so-and-so, this guy, Ben, he knows all about that one. He said, but Shannan knows all about all of them. Well, thank you very much, Peter.
Yes, sir.
But I don't know all about all of them, but I've paid a lot of attention to many of them. And I remember back in May the 15th of '72 when they tried to take out George Wallace, and Arthur Bremer, as well as the patsy that day, he was the shooter. But he had a 5-shot Smith & Wesson little Dick Tracy snub-nosed revolver. Wallace was hit 4 times in the trunk from his waist to his neck. Miraculously he survived. And next day, the New York Times, May the 16th, '72, look it up. There's a Secret Service agent was shot through the throat. A campaign woman, carrying posters and stuff, she got shot in the leg. And Wallace's Alabama Highway Patrol police captain was Wallace's personal bodyguard, and he took one in the gut. Now, you take 4 shots in Wallace and 1 each and 3 other people, 4 and 3 make 7. That's a real fast reloading of a 5-shot revolver, wasn't it?
Yep.
Now, why can't reporters catch this? I catch it the first day I read it, 10 years later, and holy smoke, here it's published right there in the New York Times, and nobody calls attention to it. Well, because they're instructed not to.
Why do you think that kind of stuff doesn't even get edited out? I mean, why even report about the extra 3 shots to other people?
Well,
why?
It will now. And in fact, I wrote in one of my musings, I think it was this month, and recently at INI, I was pointing out that in Oklahoma City, for instance, we used to tell people, and that's what really prompted it with me, that whenever something big happens, go turn on your TV and your recorder and get what the reporters are telling live on the street, because they are reporting honestly. And Oklahoma City was the brilliant classic example. Suddenly, there was this soldier boy who had driven a Ryder truck up in front, and it was filled with ammonium nitrate fuel oil and blah, 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 blah. And so the whole story changed. And so we used to tell people that you just listen to the early reports, because then you're getting the truth. Well, that's not true anymore. We don't get even the early reports aren't true anymore, because the whole scenario is already laid out. The news stories are already planted before the incident ever happened. And sometimes they screw that up. Okay, yeah, the phone's beeping. I better hang up.
All right. Well, thank you, Pat.
Sure. And listen, anytime you want clarification on anything, give me a call. I'll be happy to maybe explain some things that I didn't quite clarify today.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that.
Sure.
All
okay.
right.
Well, let me know when you get it up and how I link it.
All right. Yes, sir, I will.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well, every time I talk to Pat, I always just get more information than I can process. And, of course, that happened once again today. It's going to take me several days, maybe even a couple of weeks to absorb all of this information. I hope that you not only got an earful, but also got a brain full that you could be processing for the next few days as well. At least be processing it until this time next week when you join us again for the next episode of TBR Radio Presents, the Dixie Heritage Hour. Until then, make sure to visit INIWorldReport.com, INIWorldReport.com. That's the depository of all of Pat Shannan's reporting over the decades. And also, make sure to go to www.dixieheritage.net. While you're there, sign up for a free copy of our weekly newsletter, the Dixie Heritage Letter. You'll receive that at no cost and no obligation. And when you sign up for it, I'll even throw in a free copy of my book, The Truth About the Confederate Battle Flag. You might also want to go to the barnesreview.org website. Our sponsor, the Barnes Review, has another issue coming up here in just a few short weeks. It will be the July-August issue, and it is jam-packed, and you will not want to miss it. There are some very hard-hitting articles in there that you'll definitely want to read. Of course, for all of us here at TBR Radio Presents the Dixie Heritage Hour, we want to thank you for being one of our faithful listeners. And we ask that you send us an email. Let us know who you are. Let us know how you're listening to the Dixie Heritage Hour. And let us know if there's anything in particular that's of interest to you. Maybe, just maybe, we can do a show on it. And maybe you've written a book. Maybe you're involved in some event and you would like to get some exposure for us. Let us know. Maybe we'll have you as a guest on the Dixie Heritage Hour. Until next week, God bless.